Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our session on older workers and retirement. We have three exciting speakers. You can see their titles, their names, their titles, and other information in the program. And with that, why don't we get started? David Neumark from UC Irvine will be our first presenter.
All right, you see my slides?
Yes,
yep.
Sir.
Thank you, good. Okay, thanks so much, Rich. It's nice to see Rich here and Wendy Stock, and two of my early students from way back when. I don't know who else is on. I'm going to describe a paper that is joint with Ian Byrne, Patrick Button, and Luis Corella, who are all were students at UCI and now are off on their own doing great things. You can see what the title is, Does Ageist Language in Job Ads Predict Age Discrimination in Hiring? So let me just give you let me just talk about very briefly one study as background. Three of us, Ian, Patrick, and I, did this paper published in the JPE, which was a very large scale correspondence study, camera over a little bit, on age discrimination. Over 40,000 applications to about 13,000 positions. We did a lot of stuff in this paper and the reason we had so many applications is because we were trying to test a lot of rich hypotheses, but it turns out for the paper I'm going to talk about today, having that large number of job ads, the over 13,000, was critical. We focus on occupations that are kind of low skill. That's what one usually does in these studies, and occupations in which there's quite a bit of hiring of older workers, as we can see, let's say in CPS data. And we sent applications from triplets of young ages, think around 30, middle ages around 50, and older near retirement ages around 65. And a lot of other details, which I won't get into. They don't matter here. This is basically the descriptive statistics, which is the same answer you get after you do a lot of fancy econometrics. And what you can see here is we had admin applications among women. We had sales, both women and men, and then security and janitors, men only. For women, and you can see it here and here, very clear monotonic decline in callback rates, so clear evidence of discrimination against sort of middle-aged versus older women, younger women and older versus both. For men, you know, these all go in the downward direction, not quite as clear a monotonic march. So, and correspondingly in the fancier analyses, the evidence for men still pointed to discrimination, but was in some cases somewhat weaker. So this is the genesis of the current study. I'll actually tell you how it began. It's sort of a funny story. We had a grant to the Sloan Foundation, who funded that study as well as the studies, parts of it anyways. And I think it might have been the last sentence of the grant, or maybe it was just stuck in an appendix somewhere. We said, we will retain the text of the job ads to which we apply to see if we can detect ageist stereotypes in the ads that might predict employer behavior, which sounded like an interesting question. And I think it's turned out to be a very interesting research project. We really had no idea how to do it. And the thing we predicted terribly, oops. Can you still hear me? Someone? Yeah, okay, my camera went off. I don't know why. Doesn't matter. The thing we predicted was how complicated it was to do. Okay, my computer is beeping at me for some reason. Sorry, I'm going to turn my video off and see if it stops making that. What is going on?
Are you connected directly to the power, sir? Maybe it's the battery.
Power. No, I'm plugged in. I'm plugged in.
Okay.
I'm just going to turn the video off, and I think hopefully that'll. I have no idea why this is happening. Oh, okay, maybe we're good. So the goals of the paper are to learn about the role of age stereotypes in actual labor market discrimination. And the way to think about this is from our correspondence study, we actually have an experimenter of discrimination at each of the employers we applied to, because we sent these triplets of applications, and we could say, here's an employer that, you know, didn't call back the old person and did call back the younger person, for example. We have the text, we actually kept it, as I said, from these thousands of job ads in our study. And we use that text to identify age stereotypes in the actual language of the job ads. And we do that drawing on this very large literature on age stereotypes in, I think, what you call industrial psychology research. Mostly negative stereotypes, but not exclusively. We then relate the job ad language to stereotypes. We say how, we sort of characterize our ads by how strongly they reflect particular age stereotypes. And we do that using something from what's called computational linguistics, which I didn't know anything about before I started this, and now I know something about. I'm sure there are people who know far more than me. And then we test whether the job ads that have more stereotype language are associated with employers who posted those job ads who discriminated more based on age. So the idea is we're trying to get suggestive evidence, I think that's the right way to think about it, that discriminatory employers also post job ads with age stereotypes that typically are negative. And there's a lot more detail, you'll see what I mean. These are methods I think could be used in other contexts. You could think about this as a way to flag potentially discriminatory employers, conceivably. Maybe that's a bit far-fetched, I don't know. There's obviously other places all over labor economics in the real world as well as in research, but more so in the real world, one might say, where there's text describing people. There are performance reviews, there are recommendation letters. Now, people have done this in much less sophisticated ways, but as you'll see, we, I think, make it quite systematic. So with that said, let me kind of walk through the steps. Well, let me actually talk about this first. Why would an employer use and act on age stereotypes in job ads? Well, one very simple hypothesis is employers actually want to discriminate. They don't want to hire old workers, right? And one thing obviously, if you hire disproportionately relative to your applicants, that's the kind of thing that gets you nailed and sued and costing a lot of money. If you can actually shape the applicant pool by putting up ads that deter them from applying, that might reduce the detection of discriminatory behavior. Second hypothesis, which is more subtle, is that there may be statistical discrimination. Jobs do, in fact, have different requirements, and some of those requirements may be age-related. We don't want to deny that, that age isn't related to anything physical, of course. But of course, acting on those stereotypes is statistical discrimination. Assuming because a worker is old, they don't meet those requirements, even if on average it's true, is still statistical discrimination. And according to federal law in the US, that statistical discrimination is equally illegal. We have an experiment in the field now, which is sort of the third step of this project, which is to actually ask whether stereotype language in job ads in fact shapes the applicant pool. So what we're actually doing in the field now is running an experiment where, in contrast to a correspondence study where you have artificial applicants, we're actually putting up artificial job ads where we randomly manipulate the language to include more stereotype language, to see if ageist stereotypes in the language, and they're pretty subtle actually, deter older workers from applying. And I can't report the results yet because we're almost done collecting the data, and then we have to give people an opt-out option. But pretty soon we will have that. Okay. So the overview approach, I gave it very high level, now medium level, and then I'll dig in as much time as I have. So we start out with the industrial psych literature, and we do, I think, a very objective search of that literature, and that literature is full of meta-analyses for whatever reason, and identify the stereotypes associated with age that come out of that literature. And we end up with 17 of them. I'll show you what they are. We take the text from the job ads, we scrape that text, we use computational linguistics, this is a form of machine learning, to identify the relationship between these sort of what we call classic age stereotypes and the actual language in ads. We take the phrases in the ads and identify those that have what you call a high semantic similarity with each of the age-related stereotypes. Okay, so it's important to some people, it's confusing if you haven't heard this before. What in the world is semantic similarity? Well, you all actually do computational linguistics. I will bet every one of you does it every day. You may not know it, but when you do a Google search, what do? You put in a phrase of something you're looking for, right? And Google returns a bunch of replies, and they don't necessarily, unless you put it in quotes, of course, give you only websites that have your exact language. They give you websites, URLs, that have text with a similar meaning. And those are, forgetting about the advertising part of Google. for the most part, they're ranked in terms of how similar they are. If you go to the 10th page, the search results are often pretty unrelated, but the ones on the first page are very highly related. That's actually a computational linguistics function. In fact, the people who work in this literature often work for Google and search engines and places like that. So that's what semantic similarity is. How similar are phrases to other phrases? So we then characterize the job ads as having more or less stereotyped language. And we estimate regression models relating our experimental measure of discrimination from the correspondence study to how stereotyped the language is. Now, this is a tricky procedure because you could imagine kind of doing all this, running the regression, going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and saying, oh, I think that's stereotyped language. We were very deliberate in this process. We didn't pre-register because we didn't know enough about what we were doing to really do that in a coherent way. But we were very careful to create mechanical procedures that would ex ante, first of all, identify the stereotypes from the psych literature, then characterize the ads. And only then, once we had all that done, and that was really a huge part of the work, only then run these regressions relating it to discrimination. So there's not a data mining cherry pick thing going on here. Having figured out how to do this, we or other people could take these methods and pre-register in an experimental design and actually specify exactly what you do. Not that this is the only way to do it, but I think we have a coherent. Let me preview the results. Job ad language that predicts discrimination against older workers is actually associated with ageist stereotypes. It's not a super strong result, doesn't show up for everything, but I'll try to convince you that especially for men, language related to health, personality, and skills stereotypes does predict that the employers who use that language in ads actually are observed in an experimental setting to discriminate. For women, the evidence is a fair amount weaker, and if I have time, I'll talk about that. Okay, I'm going to skip over this part. I'm just going to show you the 17 stereotypes that come out of this literature. And I'll back up one slide. These are the phrases from the papers. So these are some of the stereotypes. These are some examples. These are phrases actually taken from the papers. So for less attractive, wrinkled, unattractive, not neat, worse looking when older. We then chose these kind of catch-all categories to categorize those. And you can see what they are here. Some are related to health, perhaps not surprising for age stereotypes. Some related to personality. And you can see things you might not, if you know this literature at all, you might not be surprised about, like less adaptable or less creative. And skills, lower ability to learn, worse with technology. Those are probably not two very surprising age stereotypes. And you can see I've highlighted in yellow, I've highlighted in orange the ones that are positive. So older people are characterized as more careful, more dependable, and obviously more experienced. And then the yellow ones kind of show up both ways in literature. So the literature in industrial psych is unclear on how people view older workers relative to younger workers. Okay. The problem is then we want to tie this to language in the job ads, but of course the job ads aren't going to say these things exactly, right? They're going to have phrases like them. So this is where we use this computational linguistics. And I'm just going to give you a really broad overview and then skip over the next few slides. But here's the way to think about it. Whenever you're doing this, you take a corpus of text, and a corpus just means a big body. And what people often use typically actually is all of English language Wikipedia, okay? You break, which is a lot, right? You break all of Wikipedia into every sentence and every paragraph, right? And then you basically do a model where you try to you then take all the phrases or the words actually in those two pieces of data, every sentence and every paragraph in all of Wikipedia, and you basically estimate a model that characterizes words by how close together they are. So whale will be semantically similar to dolphin, because whale and dolphin are probably going to show up in a lot of Wikipedia sentences and paragraphs. You know, whale and can opener are not going to be semantically related because it's hard to imagine them ever showing up in the same sentence and paragraph of Wikipedia. And it's a machine learning prediction type exercise. It's iterative and all that. But that's actually how one does these things. And that's the same way Google search engine works, actually. We then go from single words to 3-word phrases. That's not so important. Here's a sample ad. This is actually a real one. You know, you can see some of the language here: reliable, energetic, customer friendly, excellent customer service, communication, organization skills, experience preferred, computer savvy. Language from ads that sounds a lot like those 17 stereotypes I put up, even if not worded in the same way. This is the technical part I'm going to skip because you don't need to know it. But at the end of the day, you measure what's called the cosine similarity between each phrase in each ad, and there's hundreds of thousands of them, and these 17 stereotypes. And the cosine similarity score is 1 if they're identical. It's -1 if they're as orthogonal as they can be, that is, they never appear together. And then there's a range in between. So the stronger the cosine similarity score is with a stereotype, the more related the language is. Just to give you an example, here's a distribution, of the stereotype of the cosine similarity scores for communication skills. And I give you some examples. You can see the range is from sort of close to 1 to down to about -0.3. So down at the -0.3 down here, the phrases that show up are Christmas season near and hotel near Seattle, which don't sound very related to communication skills, and they aren't, and that's why they have a low cosine similarity score. Near 0, every Sunday PM work year round, also not very related. And 1, we should give some examples a little less than 1, but 1 actually have the phrases communication skills in them. So the values up here say the same thing, and the values over here would say, almost the same thing is the way to think about it. We characterize each job ad. We take for a given stereotype, we take the 95th percentile of the cosine similarity score. And the idea is most phrases in the ad won't have anything to do with anything with stereotypes. So you want to take the phrases that are more strongly related and then say, okay, but across 2 ads of the phrases that are kind of at the top of the cosine similarity score distribution, which one is more closely related to the stereotype? And then you're going to differentiate ads that way. Okay. And then you run a regression that looks like this, which is the probability that we observe discrimination. And what that means is in the correspondence study, the older person didn't get called back and the younger person did. And we run it for the 17 stereotypes on these 95th percentile scores. So basically, this is big when there's discrimination, when the older worker doesn't get the call back and the younger person does. And this is big for particular stereotype S when among the phrases most closely related to the stereotype, that particular ad has particularly stereotyped language because its 95th percentile is high. Okay, that's the basic idea there. I'm going to skip that. Let me just show you some results. So this doesn't mean anything yet, but I will highlight a few numbers. So these are the 17 stereotypes. This is a linear probability model for whether there was discrimination against the older worker in the triplet that was sent out. This highlighted coefficient right here means that there's a baseline discrimination rate of 0.096. That means the probability that older worker wasn't called back and the younger person was 0.096. If the physical ability stereotype is 1 standard deviation higher on this measure we use, then that discrimination increases by 0.038 or around a 40% increase in measured discrimination. Okay, that's what a number in this table means. It's a lot of numbers to look at, so I'm going to give you this highlighting. Okay, so what the heck is going on here? I've highlighted the significant results, at least at the 10% level. A dark red means there was more discrimination. So for example, here back that same number, physical ability, when there was stereotype language about physical ability, and by far for that one, the most common phrase is must be able to lift 40 pounds. Older workers are less likely to get called back. So the dark reds are all the cases where there's more discrimination. Here's a hearing-related stereotype, a memory-related stereotype, an adaptability-related stereotype. The greens are less discrimination. You can see they show up for careful. And they show up for down here for productive. That stereotype cuts both ways. And then the ones that are dark are consistent with the industrial psych literature. So these are dark reds and these are dark greens. And the ones that are kind of the lightly shaded ones are not consistent. So basically what's going on here is most of the significant results when you get them are either dark red or dark green instead of the lightly shaded one. And that means we're getting evidence that's consistent with the stereotypes from the industrial psych literature. A stereotype of older workers have less physical ability is consistent with when the language refers to physical ability, there's more measured discrimination against older workers. That's exactly what this means. So you can see here, for men, this is for men, there's quite a few of these. For women, a lot less. And actually only the stereotypes that are actually favorable to older people among women. So you don't find much going on there. Time is very short. It's a long, messy paper, but let me try to summarize and give you a few other thoughts. So the conclusion we reach is that ageist stereotypes may actually affect, maybe too strong a word, be related to hiring of older workers, but certainly find that job ad language that's highly related to ageist stereotypes is associated with hiring discrimination. And for men, it's about all three of the types of stereotypes we consider: health, personality, and skills. Most evidence is in the direction predicted by the industrial psych literature, including sometimes positive stereotypes. Most of this appears for men, little for women. What's the limitation of this? Well, certainly not all discrimination, not all things employers think about older workers can be conveyed in job language. So for example, we found much weaker evidence for women of stereotypes mattering, even though in the correspondence study, we found stronger evidence of age discrimination. It may be because some of the stereotypes about older women are harder to express in job ad language. I mean, there's a sort of lookism penalty for older women. This is well established in the literature. We discussed it in the JP paper that, you know, older women are sort of given lower ratings on beauty or looks than older men are. There's more of an age penalty for women than men. Well, that may be a stereotype or something employers think about older workers, but people's looks don't really show up in ads, right? You don't really write a job ad that refers to how good looking you are. So there may be a lot of discrimination, but it may not show up. Or it may be that the language just doesn't do as much to deter women from hiring, so employers don't do it. I think another implication is that the policy response we have, how we enforce discrimination laws, may need to be more nuanced. If ads, in the language in ads, can affect the applicant pool, then the typical way we kind of monitor and enforce the law and actually sue employers when we think they're discriminating by comparing hiring rates to application rates may miss the boat, right? Because we may have shaped the pool. A very sort of salient example of that is the EEOC warns employers pretty strongly against using language about criminal background in job ads where criminal background actually isn't very important, right? Why? Well, because of the way our system works, blacks have much higher criminal record rates than whites do. And if you put in job ad language that suggests you're not going to hire people with criminal records, even in jobs where it doesn't matter, like you're laying asphalt in North Dakota or something, they're just not going to apply. They're going to take the signal and not apply. That's more extreme example in this one, but it's the same idea that we may need to pay attention to language as well as, not just start with who applies, but think about what shapes who applies. And attorneys in discrimination cases talk about this in other settings about so-called what they call tainted variables, or what we would call as econometricians bad controls that are themselves affected by discrimination. But this points to yet another type that whether or not you applied could itself be tainted. Here's actually language about the ADEA that says, refers from the language you shouldn't use. This is from the Code of Federal Regulations. And it talks about, obviously, references to age, not surprisingly, or young, interestingly, college student, recent college graduate. Those are things that are not explicitly about age, but not so subtly about age. And our research, I think you could think about as pointing to far more subtle clues in job ad language that may signal the kind of stereotyping that could predict discriminatory behavior. Thank you.
Great, thank you, David. So I am the discussant for David's paper, and I will share my screen right now. Thank you, Aida from Farmand, for organizing this session and for inviting me to participate and for giving me the opportunity to read David's paper. Like all of David's papers, and particularly those with these co-authors, it deals with an important topic. It's extremely thorough. It uses innovative techniques, and it makes a significant contribution to the literature. So let me just summarize for his approach. What he and his co-authors do is they examine the impact of ageist language in job postings on age discrimination in hiring. And as David pointed out, this importantly builds on the results of some previous work that he and two of his co-authors have done on age discrimination. So they conducted a resume correspondence study a few years ago. That study indicated which job applicants received callbacks So as he said, he sent out these identical, he sent out fake resumes that were pretty much identical except for age, could identify which older and younger workers received a callback. In this study, what he and his co-authors are doing are relating the job posting language to the likelihood of those callbacks. So the first task here is, well, first I want to just talk about the earlier correspondence study. David did summarize it, but it's important to understand exactly how that was done. So there were fake resumes from 3 age groups. The younger group, 29 to 31, middle-aged, 49 to 51, and the older, 64 to 66. So when we're using these terms, young, middle-aged, and older, it's these very specific age groups that he's looking at. And then he also looked at results separately for men and women, and he sent out resumes to more than 13,000 job positions. So this was an extremely comprehensive study. It was really carefully done. I believe I commented on this paper years ago when it was still being developed, and so I had to read it thoroughly at that point, and it was just really amazed at how carefully the work was done and how careful the authors were to try to ensure that these resumes were as similar as they could be, except for age. They only differed on the basis of age, and they spent a lot of time trying to account for other types of biases that might have affected their results. So they examined callbacks to several low-skilled jobs. So as David said, for men, it's sales, janitorial, and security jobs. For women, it's administrative and sales jobs. And the results show that older women received significantly fewer older workers, fewer callbacks than younger workers. And the difference was especially large for women. Now, the innovation in this study is to classify job ads by age stereotypes and then relate those stereotypes to the callback. So the first thing he had to do, he and his co-authors had to do, was identify these age stereotypes from the industrial psychology literature. David put those up there, so I'll just do this very quickly. But I think this alone is quite interesting. He classified them into 3 groups: health, personality, and skills. The health was all negative. The stereotypes about older folks were all negative. So less physically able, hard of hearing, worse memory, and then less attractive, not really health, but didn't really belong in any of the other categories. Personality was more mixed in terms of the stereotypes. Some of them were positive, some negative. So on the one hand, older workers deemed to be thought to be less adaptable, but on the other hand, also more careful, less creative, but more dependable. And then personality was somewhat mixed. This negative stereotype, grouchy, get off the lawn, to a more warming, caring grandmother type of personality, perhaps. Skills also somewhat mixed, so a lower ability to learn, but communication skills could be better or worse. More experience could be a positive thing, could be more or less productive. And then perhaps the most common stereotype we have against older workers is that they're worse with technology. So as David explained, they had to then scrape text from job ads and use language processing software and machine learning to identify language related to age stereotypes and then measure the strength of that relationship. And I think you got from David's presentation just how complicated this was, but also how carefully done it was. I think it's really innovative. And what's particularly exciting about this is I think these are methods that could be used in other labor market research. That's something that David and his co-authors suggest in the paper. So here are the results. David summarized them nicely. What I'm showing here are just the significant results at the 5% level. Some of these sample sizes are not that large, so that 5% could be a pretty high hurdle. A lot of the results are not, a lot of the these stereotypes are not do not have a statistically significant impact on these callbacks. But so if we look at the health stereotypes, we see we only have a significant impact for middle-aged men, and I've identified plus meaning that these stereotypes increase discrimination, as David did, negative meaning it decreases discrimination. Here, green means it's consistent with the industrial psychology literature. So we see that for health, We don't have a lot of significant effects. All of them apply to middle-aged men, but they're all consistent with the literature. For personality types, most of them are significant with the literature, the only exception being that for ads that talk about the importance of creativity, there we see against that discrimination against middle-aged men applying for security jobs is actually reduced. That's not what you would expect, but the others go in the same direction. We see some impacts here for older men, one impact for older women. And then for the skill stereotypes, here some of the impacts are inconsistent with what we would expect. So ability to learn actually reduces discrimination against middle-aged men in sales, emphasizing the importance of experience, increases discrimination against men applying for janitorial jobs. So I say there's somewhat of a mixed bag here. So what do we make from these results? I think we can say that they ageist language and job postings sometimes predict discrimination against older workers. Results were strongest for middle-aged men. That's a little bit of a surprise because we know that discrimination from David's previous work is more prevalent among older women, and the middle-aged men had the least discrimination seemed to be least affecting them less than the other gender, and less than women and less than older men. But I thought David's explanation was interesting, that it could just be that the discrimination that women face is really not something that would be expressed in a job posting. Now, one of the, I think, complicating the understanding of these results is that ageist language can discourage older workers from applying. David said tainting the applicant pool, and that could reduce the impact of age discrimination in callbacks. If all of your applicants are your young folks, you don't have to discriminate against older applicants in that case. I think it'd be interesting, though, if the authors could say something about the prevalence of ageist language in job postings, because it would be useful to know, really just how common this practice is. On the other hand, it is a little difficult to understand exactly what to make of this ageist language and how ageist is it really. So, for example, the authors suggest in the paper, at least, that perhaps we want to change our policies to take a stronger stand against ageist language in job postings. But a lot of this, as David pointed out, was pretty subtle. I don't think we want to outlaw phrases like computer savvy, high energy, and experienced. And it's just important to keep in mind that the study was restricted to less skilled jobs. These may not generalize to workers with more skills and education. On the other hand, I think these are probably this is the group that perhaps we care most about because they face the most important employment challenges. So in conclusion, I think this is an important contribution to a growing literature documenting challenges facing older workers. We know that working until Social Security and Medicare eligibility is crucial for many people, especially those who don't have a lot of education, don't have a lot of skills. If you work even later than that, that's going to improve your financial security at older ages. And yet we know many people in their 50s and 60s experience shocks that force them to leave their jobs. And this paper is part of the growing evidence that employers are reluctant to hire older workers. So what can we do about that? So one thing we can do is we can think about strengthening age discrimination laws. Those are hard to enforce, even if the laws are strong. So that's not going to be a panacea, but it could help. I think improving workforce development programs for older workers could be an important piece of this puzzle. We don't spend a lot of money on workforce development as it is. So for all age groups, we spend very little on older workers. We could think about expanding the earned income tax credit for older workers. We could reduce the cost of employing older workers and hiring older workers by eliminating the payroll tax at older ages, because employers pay half of that cost. We could make Medicare the primary payer for healthcare costs for workers with health coverage. There's still going to be people who can't work until they reach traditional retirement age. And for those folks, we can think about bolstering the disability safety net, maybe making SSI available to younger people, even if they don't have a disability. We could think about reducing the Medicare eligibility age. Maybe we don't want to think about raising the Social Security eligibility age. But in conclusion, just congratulations to David and his co-authors for another exciting and important bit of research. So that brings us a little behind schedule to our next paper, which is, let's see.
This is Galt's paper.
Yes,
and,
that's right.
I will be the discussant.
Yes, thank you. So Gal Wettstein will be presenting his paper on are older workers capable of working longer.
Thanks, Rich. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Can you see my slides? Great. So as Rich said, well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for such an interesting session and for including us on this panel. I'm going to be talking about whether older workers are capable of working longer. Rich brought this up in his last couple of slides just a moment ago. This is joint work with my colleague at the CRR, Laura Quinby. She's on this call as well. And the work was funded by the Social Security Administration, so I need to say that the views of the paper don't represent the views of SSA or of Boston College, and we take full responsibility for any errors or omissions. In terms of a little bit of motivation, Rich just mentioned this as well. Working longer has been shown to be one of the best ways to improve retirement security. Extending working life lets people contribute longer to their savings. It allows accumulated savings to compound longer. It reduces the length of time that people spend without income in retirement. And it enables later claiming of Social Security benefits, which increases monthly benefits by raising, by the actuarial adjustment, as well as by including higher earnings in the lifetime average. And numerous studies have shown that this is the best way to increase retirement income for those who can do it. However, there are, of course, many factors that might prevent people from working as long as they might otherwise want. We know that work-limiting disability grows more common with age. Institutionalization, by which I mean both carceral and long-term service and support facilities. Any kind of institutionalization like that would, of course, be an insurmountable barrier to work. And studies have shown that disability-free life expectancy has been rising over time. However, much of the gain in past decades was attributable to rising educational attainment, which stalled in recent cohorts. So what we wanted to do in this paper was to see whether working life expectancy is still rising. And then in addition to that, we wanted to delve deeper into the question of whether it's rising for people who don't have the benefit of high education. In general, I'll be talking about working life expectancy, and I would like to fix this idea as something parallel to life expectancy, just with the added caveat that you can also work as well as being alive. And so working life expectancy depends on three factors, at least in our conceptualization of it, and that's mortality, institutionalization, and disability. Mortality we get from the National Vital Statistics System, so it's the full count of deaths in the US. We get an estimate of the population size, it's a denominator for everything, as well as who is institutionalized from the American Community Survey. And we get rates of work-limiting disability from the National Health Interview Survey. And all these data sets can be broken down by gender, race, and education. I guess I'll mention here that I'll mostly talk about estimates by age, but in reality, because the NVSS gives us full population counts of deaths, it's a pretty large data set, so we can estimate mortality rates by single age years. Whereas for the other two measures, institutionalization and disability, because it surveys, we estimate things by 5-year age bins for larger sample sizes. Now, I mentioned demographics. It turns out that defining demographic groups isn't completely trivial. Race and gender are relatively straightforward. We follow the Census Bureau definitions. But for education, we faced a choice of whether we would look at education in absolute terms or in relative terms. And we went with the relative route. The reason was that absolute education has been shown to lead to some misleading conclusions when you do analysis over time, because the selection on unobserved socioeconomic characteristics that's associated with different levels of absolute educational attainment just vary over time quite a bit. So just to give an example, if you think of someone who hasn't completed high school today, that's a pretty strong indication of kind of quite low socioeconomic status, whereas that wasn't really the case maybe 50 years ago. It's also true that this happens across race and gender. And I don't think it would surprise anyone that a Black man who completes college today is much more selected out of the group of Black men than a white man who completes college. And so we define everything in relative terms based on these race gender cohort groups. And in particular, we say that your high education, if for your race, gender, and cohort, you're above the median level of educational attainment, and low education if you're below the median level for your. So once we have these demographic groups, we can proceed with the analysis, and we do it in 4 steps by estimating each of these components: mortality, institutionalization, and disability, and then putting them all together. So starting with mortality, that itself is broken down into 2 stages. First, we estimate non-parametric mortality by age. So for every age, we estimate the probability of surviving to the next age. But it turns out that when you do that, even with the full population of deaths, at some cells, you end up with small samples. Think of 90-year-old, Black, low education men. There aren't that many deaths in a given year. So to smooth out this function, we actually fit a mortality function to these non-parametric mortality rates. So that eliminates this small cell size problem and ensures that mortality is monotonic in age. Okay, that's mortality. Institutionalization also requires a little bit of explanation. So as I said, we're considering institutions as both long-term care settings like nursing homes and carceral institutions like prisons. Full disclosure, we weren't intending to include prisons in this analysis when we started out, but it turns out in the ACS, it's really hard to distinguish why a person is institutionalized. It turned out to be a good thing for us in the sense that imprisonment is in the results, it turns out to be an important factor in whether some people can work, especially low education men and Black men in particular. And so the definition is quite straightforward. We just look at the share of people who are institutionalized in any 5-year age bin, and that gives us both the prison and the long-term care restrictions. Finally, for work-limiting disability, we get this from the NHIS, and it's based on a series of 3 questions that the survey asks. Does a physical, mental, or emotional problem keep you from working? Are you limited in the kind or amount of work you can do because of your health? And are you limited in any way because of physical, mental, or emotional problems? We consider a person to have a work-limiting disability if they answered yes to any of these, but the results are qualitatively very similar if we just use the first 2 or if we just use the first question. And all of those results are in the paper. Finally, once we have these 3 components, we can combine them all. We take the complement of each of these non-working states, death, institutionalization, or disability. We multiply those complements to get the probability of not being in any of those states. And then we sum those up over the years of remaining life to get the expectation of remaining years of workability. Now here I'd like to dwell a little bit on a delicate matter of interpretation of the results. which is that the analysis produces a period, but not cohort estimate. And this is really analogous, again, to life expectancy, where we'll often talk about period life expectancy rather than cohort. And the reason we do that, well, let me first say what that is. So what the analysis does is it takes the current death, disability, and institutionalization rates by age and gives a snapshot of the average years of working life now. But that doesn't account for any future changes in those rates. Again, to take the life expectancy analogy, for a 50-year-old now, we know that in 20 years, they're going to face a lower mortality rate at age 70 than a 70-year-old now, because of improvements in health and various other things. Doing that, accounting for that, really requires strong assumptions. The Social Security Administration provides those assumptions for the full population for mortality, but it doesn't give us anything for the other outcomes or for subgroups. So the whole analysis is going to ignore what's probably going to happen in terms of mortality changes in the future, as well as changes in potentially disability and institutionalization. As a result, what we need to think about these results is that they're a summary of current conditions, but they're not predictions of outcomes for any particular group or person. Now, I've been talking about life expectancy, and this is a familiar distinction for people who deal with life expectancy, but it actually turns out to be quite important in thinking about incarceration in particular, because when we think of people who are incarcerated in their 50s and 60s and 70s now, those are usually situations that resulted from sentencing decisions that happened decades ago. And so just we need to keep that in mind when we think about how to interpret the results. These are descriptive results, but not predictive. So with those caveats in mind, I'm going to turn to presenting our results. And I'm going to do it first for each of the separate components, the life expectancy, institutionalization, and work limiting ability, disability. I'll do it for each of for the full population, and then I'll talk at the end about results for demographic groups. So in thinking about life expectancy, we find that life expectancy has increased. I should probably say that this doesn't include, we stopped our analysis in 2018, we don't include any of this COVID impact on mortality, which of course is dramatic based on other work. But up to 2018, life expectancy had been rising. It was rising for men and for women, and it was rising whether or not we did the analysis by period or cohort. You can see that here. And just for a final time to bring home the intuition of period versus cohort, you can see that the cohort life expectancy is always higher than the period life expectancy because it includes the probability of improved mortality in future years. As I said, the rest of the analysis is purely a period one. Turning to institutionalization, I'm going to start for women because it's more straightforward. For women, institutionalization rises with age. That's not surprising, but it declines over time for a given age. So we know from other work as well that nursing home utilization is declining, and this is really consistent with what we know about that. For men, that's not quite the case. For men, we see a U-shape in age for institutionalization. It's high in the 50s and somewhat in the early 60s, and then it is high again in the late 70s and 80s. Now, what's going on here? It turns out that men are much more likely to be incarcerated than women. And so what we see in these earlier midlife groups is really the effect of incarceration for men. And as that phases out, when men get older, that's when nursing home use starts to take off, and that's how we get this U-shape. It also impacts the time pattern of the results. While at older ages, institutionalization is declining for men just like for women, at younger ages, it's actually increasing. And that's again reflecting the fact that when you think of a 50-year-old in 2018, that person was in their 20s in the 90s when tough on crime policies were really ramping up. And so this increasing incarceration rate is driving the increased institutionalization rate over time for younger men. So this is just restating what I just said. I'm going to skip over and talk about disability. So disability is pretty straightforward. We see that it's increasing in age, which is not surprising, but it's pretty flat over time within age groups. So there's no increase in disability rates within an age group. Of course, that means that for the population as a whole, there's an increasing trend in disability as the population ages. But controlling for age, that's flat. What that gives us in the end is a growth in total disability-free life expectancy. But that growth has slowed since 2006. So in this slide, I'm comparing results from 2000 to 2006 to results from our current paper of 2006 to 2018. So for the 6 years of 2000 to 2006, life expectancy in total rose by about a year and a half for both men and women, of which only a quarter of a year was time spent in disability. In contrast, for the full 12 years between 2006 and 2018, life expectancy rose by only a bit over a year, so a much slower pace of growth. And much more starkly, more than half of that time was time spent in disability. Of course, even slow progress is progress. So the average person at this point can expect to be capable of work through their early 70s. But that average conceals a lot of heterogeneity by subgroups. And the rest of my presentation is going to be devoted to these subgroup differences. So when thinking about working life expectancy in 2018, the most recent year we looked at, you can see that there's a really wide range of expected years of working life for different groups. And just to take the most stark comparison, at age 50 for above median education white men, they can expect to be able to work until they're 75 and a half. Whereas below median education black men can only expect to be able to work until they're 63 and a half. So twice as long almost for the white high education versus the black low education. That's a difference in levels. But it turns out that the growth rates are also wildly divergent. And in fact, almost the entire growth of working life expectancy for the population between 2006 and 2018 has been from high education groups. Low education groups have completely stalled. There's been no growth for any of the low education groups except for low education black women, who saw a pretty impressive decline in mortality rates. But other than that, low education black men, low education white men and women, no growth whatsoever in their working life expectancy over the last 12 years. What that means, looking beyond averages, is that a majority of low education black men won't be able to work even until their full retirement age of 67. Compare that to the full population, you see that on the rightmost columns. About 90% of women and about 85% of men will be able to reach their full retirement age when you look at the full population. But more than half of low education black men, more than a third of low education black women will not. And this is of people who are capable of work at age 62. The problem looks even more severe when we consider the maximal claiming age of 70. For the full population, about 20 to 30% of all people will not be able to work till age 70, so most will. But 3/4 of low education black men and almost 2/3 of low education black women won't be able to work until that age. And the problem is still bad even for high education black men, especially, where almost half of them, 40% of them, will not be able to work until the maximal retirement age. So to sum up, what we find is that both life expectancy and working life expectancy have continued their upward trends, but at a declining rate since 2006. In recent years, over half of every life year gained is one in which work is not possible. What that means is that in 2018, working life expectancy is over 70 for both men and women, but that when you look at subgroups, there's all of the improvement has come from the upper half of the education distribution. For the low education people, especially for low education Black men, the problem is really severe because they already start at a really low level of working life expectancy in 2006. For that group, a majority will not be able to work until their full retirement age. In terms of policy, that means that we need to think of other solutions beyond working longer for the retirement security of these vulnerable groups. And as Rich mentioned, we might want to reconsider raising retirement eligibility ages in Social Security, at least if we, at least when we think of these particularly vulnerable groups. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Gal, and thanks especially for staying on time because I don't quite know how to tell you to stop talking over Zoom. I shouldn't let the other speakers know that. Anyway, so now Siavash Radpour from the New School for Social Research will tell us whether we should believe anything you just said. And I think you're on mute.
Yeah, so it shows that relatively younger people can also be technologically disabled, obviously. So thank you so much, Rich, and thank you, Gal and Laura, for this great paper. I really enjoyed reading this. And the paper answers a very important question, which is like who can work longer and what are the disparities in the ability to work at older ages. I was pleasantly surprised to see the inclusion of incarcerated people, but then of course I'm a bit disappointed now that I heard that it wasn't a choice, because I think that they are a very important population and often ignored in our studies. Mostly because of the convenience. This is a very concise piece, short but precise, and covers all the bases, and it has clear conclusions and very important policy implications, as you just heard, especially about full retirement age and Social Security. So just a bit of context. There is a lot going on about working longer, and there are lots of studies, of course, that look at either the supply side, the demand side, or the institutional side of working longer. So we just heard David Neumark's paper about the demand side and age discrimination, and whether or not employers want older workers to work. There is also the question of whether employers want to pay for older workers and their skill and experience, which is something Rich talked about yesterday, and we will hear about it later from Aida. But of course, there is also the labor supply side. First of all, do older workers actually need to work longer? We know from different sources, from SIPA and also from CRR, that many older workers are not financially prepared for their retirement. 2019 National Retirement Risk Index showed that 49% of American households were not ready for retirement. And of course, some people disagree. Like the classic paper is Schwartz et al. 2006, who said most people do have enough for retirement, and there are plenty of articles in plenty of places that argue that people are prepared for retirement. We are not discussing that here, and I think most people here agree. Many people here agree that at least a big chunk of population are not prepared for the retirement. And for those population, one of the solutions that have been discussed a lot is working longer. And of course, there are also questions regarding that, whether or not working longer can actually prevent downward mobility and poverty in retirement. The paper from SIPA authors, Ghilarducci, Papadopoulos, and Webb from 2020, showed that it's not really the case, and because many low earners claim Social Security while working at early ages and do not have retirement coverage or the ability to save, even though working longer will reduce years in retirement, it won't improve the final outcome, which is like number one relating to poverty. And of course, we have all the social and institutional factors determining whether or not people will work longer, which is like the signaling effect of FRA, and also whether or not we want, as a society, we want people to work much longer until they die, basically. And there is also this look at time in retirement as an asset and the inequality in time in retirement. So who is actually enjoying a happy retirement, and who is sick in retirement, and who doesn't even have enough time, only a few years in retirement when they're disabled and sick. So these are different aspects of it. And this paper tries to answer a very particular part of it. So given no change in labor demand or institutional factors, are older workers actually physically capable of working longer or not? So that's where this paper fits in the literature. So of course, these are people who are alive, not institutionalized, and don't have work limiting disabilities. So the paper goes through all these three factors separately and looks at the trends and disparities among different groups in these trends. So most of the gains in life expectancy is going to higher educated groups. But like all groups are like experiencing at least a little bit of growth in life expectancy. Institutionalization rates are down overall, except for Black men who are facing higher incarceration rates in their 50s and 60s. And in general, we don't see any increase or decrease in work limiting disabilities, which means people spend more time in retirement disabled or with like a serious loss of abilities, which will reduce their quality of retirement, of course. So the findings are very clear. There are large disparities in working life expectancy and ability to work between and within groups. As you can see, like, for example, for low educated white workers, the line is quite steep, showing that like there is like large disparities between individuals in this group, and Black men have the lowest working life expectancy among these groups, which means like any decrease in full retirement age will seriously harm their retirement income and their standards of living in retirement. So I'm going to keep it very short and go directly to discussions because yesterday I learned my lesson not to ask too many questions and keep it short, so that to actually give a chance for the presenters to respond if they want to. So the first thing that comes to mind is the research question. So we are not interested in the total labor supply. So we don't want to know like how many people in total can work. So the main question that we are interested in, or the authors are interested in, my point of view, is working longer a feasible solution for lack of retirement preparedness? So what comes to my mind is that, do we really care about mortality rates there? So something like looking at gains in longevity, does it really matter here? Like there are very little advantages in being dead, but one of them is not needing any retirement income. So in that sense, like maybe we don't need to like limit the sample to like don't really need to look at gains in longevity and like lower mortality rates, and just look at disability among those who can live. Like it's a matter of like sample selection versus looking at the risks of who can work actually. The second problem is, or the issue that I want to discuss, is the endogeneity issue with the supply, because we are assuming that, okay, the demand is there, will they work or not? Can they physically or mentally work or participate in any activities or not? But the problem is, as we heard from Rick Johnson yesterday, that many people are retired and pushed out of work involuntarily. So many separations are involuntary, even if people are able to work. And that creates a lot of endogeneity here, because that has health effects, that has effects on incarceration rates and disability. So if these people were actually able to work, they would have like a higher longevity and less risk of disability. So you can't clearly separate the supply side and demand side here and just look at the supply and say, okay, like these people like obviously cannot work. Maybe if they had good income, if they actually had jobs and employment opportunity, they would have lived longer. So there are some issues there. And there is like plenty of literature about how mortality, disability, and incarceration are affected by employment prospect. And like the same issue with mortality and filtering, including the risk of death, is like also applies to incarceration and temporary versus permanent institutionalization. Like, do we actually have to discuss like people who are permanently institutionalized are not able to work? Like, is that actually something we care about or not? Like, do we want to include them in the sample or not? And of course, my final comment is that we don't know much about long-term effects of COVID-19 and how that will affect not just mortality, but also the rates of disability, and how it will change this picture somehow. And if you have any comments on that. Thank you so much. It was a great paper to read. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Siavash. Gal, would you like to respond to anything that Siavash said? And no obligation, we can happily go on to the next speaker. But
thanks, Siavash. Those were really great comments. I guess I would say two things to respond to your questions. One, about whether it's relevant to look at people who are dying and they don't need to support themselves in retirement. That's certainly true. We actually gave that a lot of thought when we were starting this project. And it turns out that most people who work actually have people depending on them. So we thought, oh, well, at least you don't have to support yourself, but your family might still be relying on your labor income. And so that we decided to include that issue. And then in terms of the effect of retirement on health, I know there's a big literature, but I think it's not very clear cut whether the effect is positive or negative. So we just abstracted away from it and stayed neutral on the really controversial topic. But yeah, otherwise, thank you for the comments. Very good food for thought.
Thank you, Gail. So our third and final paper is How Job Displacement Affects Work and Social Security Claiming in Older Ages, presented by Aida Farmand of the New School for Social Research. And Aida, take it away.
Hi, thank you. Okay, I just need to share my screen. Sorry, just a second. Okay, can you see my slides? Okay, great. So yes, and thank you for moderating the meeting. So my paper is how job displacement affects labor market outcomes at older ages. I will continue with the results. Sorry, just having some problems. Okay. So the overall research question is, how do the incidence, cost, and duration of job displacement differ by age and other demographics? I also investigate how these outcomes have evolved over time. So just for a little bit of motivation of why I chose to focus on displacement at older ages, so just a few points. So as we know, older workers are a significant and growing share of the labor force. So in 2021, they're about 24% of the labor force, and it's expected that in 10 years, the labor pool of people 65 and older is gonna grow by more than 50%. So if they're unable to recover from job loss, or if they're becoming more prone to losing their jobs at older ages, that would undermine their bargaining power in the labor market. And since they're a big share of the labor force, it's going to impact all workers' bargaining power as well. Just a definition of displacement is that they're permanently and involuntarily separated from their jobs for reasons that are not correlated to their own performance. A lot of people actually experience job displacement. So for example, during the period of 2017 to 2022, more than 6 million workers were displaced. I think around a third of them were over 55. So that's another important thing to note. And lastly, in order to understand whether working longer is a feasible policy solution for the lack of retirement readiness of older workers, we need to understand how they can recover from job loss. So that's also important when you're talking about that policy as a solution to lack of retirement preparedness. So just to touch on some of the previous research done on this topic, there are many papers. I just picked the ones that I thought were more closely related to what I'm going to talk about. So the first paper, they actually analyzed the wage losses correlated with job loss, and they find that median losses for workers reemployed full-time were not large, but sizable minority of that group, which are mostly workers who have a lot of firm-specific human capital, they experience large and enduring earnings losses. Also similar to that are the second paper, Jacobson and co-authors, that they find that displaced workers experience long-term losses averaging around 25% of their income. But also they, contrary to other studies, they find that these impacts depend only slightly on age and gender, and mostly depend on they mostly depend on labor market conditions and the workers' former industry. And then two other papers, so one from Alicia Munel and co-authors, was written in 2006. They basically use the same data that I'm going to use, but the study goes back, I think, to 2004, and they find no major trends in the displacement of older workers over the 11 years that they studied, but they also find major earnings losses among those who lose their jobs. And lastly, work from Richard Johnson, who is also on this panel. He analyzes the same question using the health and retirement study, and he finds that almost half of older workers experience some sort of involuntary separation from their job, and that they experience a lot of wage loss as well. So just to preview my findings, I find that displacement rates for old and mid-career has converged over time, and that older workers experience more wage loss following job displacement. So they're 3 times more likely to experience major wage loss compared to mid-career workers. But I don't find any major trends that have occurred over time for this this group. Just to be clear, older workers in my definition are workers over 55, and mid-career workers are people between 35 and 54. And then I find that older workers spend more time in unemployment, post-displacement, around 40 to 60% more time. It takes around 40 to 60% more time for them to find a full-time job following displacement. And they're less likely to transition to a job regardless of hours, and they're more likely to stay unemployed or to leave the labor force altogether. So this is the overview of the methods that I used. So the incidence of displacement is measured by modeling the probability of job loss. The cost of this displacement is measured by the difference between pre and post displacement wages. And here also investigate the impact of displacement on Social Security claiming earlier. So people who claim Social Security earlier than the full retirement age. And also I investigate the unemployment durations that are measured based on the Cox proportional hazard ratios of exiting unemployment. So I already said the definition for displacement, but just to be clear, there are involuntary separations based on operating decisions of the employer. So they're not quitting basically. And the data that I'm going to use comes from the Displaced Worker Survey, which is a supplement to the Current Population Survey, and it's run in January usually. And it goes back from 1996 to the latest data available, which is covers 2020. It was conducted in January 2020. So one major limitation of my work is that job loss is, as measured in these data, does not report all job losses. So the distinction between quit and layoff is not always clear. So firms may wish to reduce employment by reducing wages or not raising them. So that's one thing that I can't really see and address using this data. So before I go to my regression results, I'm just going to show a couple of descriptive evidence and to just highlight the key patterns in the data. So this is the incidence of job loss, the 3-year job loss rate over time. And it's defined as the number of people who experienced job loss over the last 3 years divided by the total employment of that age group. So as we can see here, regardless if we just look at old versus young or mid-career, we can see that older workers are less likely to lose their jobs and experience displacement compared to younger workers. But over time, these two trends have converged. But if we just focus on workers that do not have long tenure, so this is the graph for workers that have less than 4 years of tenure with the same employer. Now here the graph flips and looks totally different. Now older workers are more prone to job loss compared to younger workers, and this is something that is going to be confirmed also with the regression results. This is kind of a descriptive table to capture the cost of job loss and to see the differences between mid-career and older worker regarding their what percentage of them experience major wage losses when they get displaced. So major earnings losses are defined as anyone who is experiencing a wage less than 80% of their previous wage. So from here we can actually see two things, conclude two important takeaways. One, that older workers with long tenure suffer more wage losses compared to their younger counterparts. So that a bigger share of them experience wage losses compared to the mid-career workers. And that signals that the returns to tenure are more closely tied to their firm-specific and occupation-specific skills, which is foregone when they're displaced. And second, they could also indicate that older workers are not becoming more expensive due to their seniority or union premiums, because the share of older workers that experience wage loss post-displacement is not showing any increasing trend over time. So again, just to reiterate, this is the share of workers who experience major earning losses following displacement by age and years of tenure. And this is a descriptive statistics that shows the duration of job loss for unemployment, job loss after displacement. It's the average number of weeks unemployed following job loss by age. So average number of weeks spent in unemployment has increased for older workers from 11 weeks back in I think around 1996 to 13 weeks in 2020. But the average time spent in unemployment for younger workers, mid-career workers hasn't changed. It has stayed about 9 weeks throughout time. Okay, so these are the specifications of the regressions. So one probability regression is used to estimate the probability of being displaced. The dependent variable is equal to 1 if the worker was displaced during the 3-year survey period, and 0 otherwise, and a similar probability result for regression for estimating major earn losses. The dependent variable there is equal to 1 if the worker experienced a sharp drop in earnings and 0 otherwise. So this is the first set of results for the incidence of displacement by age. So similar to the paper by Monell and co-authors in 2006, I utilized 2 probit models, one without including the tenure variable and one with the inclusion of the tenure variable. This will allow me to distinguish between the impacts of age and tenure on probability of displacement. And these equations also have other variables for gender, race, and education, and some of them are significant and worthy of discussion. So from this probit model that doesn't include tenure, we find in line with earlier studies that the probability of being displaced declines with age. So this is the marginal effects for the probability of displacement, and it goes from 1996 to 2020. And we can see that over time, although older workers were always less likely to be displaced, over time that coefficient has gone down. So that's also the converging trend that we saw from the descriptive statistics. To be more precise, for example, in 1996, there was a 2.5 percentage points difference between older workers and mid-career workers. So they were 2.5 percentage points less likely to experience displacement, but in 2020, that basically it reduces to 0.3 percentage difference. This is also including, again, this doesn't include the tenure variable. To compare that with this table, so this is the same regression, basically, just I included the tenure variables. So these results suggest that tenure and not age protected older workers from displacement. So in 2020, older workers were more likely than mid-career workers or younger workers to be displaced. Therefore, when older workers change jobs later in their careers, they're in increasing risk of displacement. Women also are in line with other studies. Women are less likely to experience displacement. Black workers, we don't find any significance for race, Black or Hispanic. Public sector workers are less likely to be displaced. Another important result here is for college. So we can see that in 1996, there was a significant and negative marginal effect for displacement on college, but by 2020, it's still significant at the 10% level and negative, but the coefficient is really small. So it seems like the protection of having a college degree has actually gone away over time. Now I can move on to the earnings losses. This is, as I said, it's a probate on major earnings losses, and it includes all the variables that I've already talked about on the last slide. So it's pretty much in line with whatever other researchers have found before, that older workers and mid-career workers suffer more wage losses compared to the unmeted age group, which is 20 to 35. But also the differences between mid-career and older is still pretty pronounced. So it's about 3 times as likely for older workers to experience major wage loss compared to mid-career workers. Also, female and Black workers are more likely to experience wage losses. But then another important thing that I want to highlight here is the table on the right. So although older workers are more likely to experience wage loss after displacement, there's no clear pattern over time. So on the right side, as you can see, it seems like it has a very strong cyclical pattern with 4 times that are capturing the recessions. For example, in 2010, the coefficient is large and significant. That's because it's just picking up on the effects of the Great Recession, which happened like 2 or 3 years before that. And now these are the results for the interaction, the marginal, the interaction between age and race and age and sex. So we can see that Black workers, older Black workers are more likely to suffer wage losses post-displacement, and also female older workers are more likely to suffer wage losses. This is something that is not mentioned often in the literature. The focus on older workers is not very prevalent in the literature, and so in line with that, much attention is not given to minority groups of older workers either. So we saw the effect on earnings and the probability of displacement. Now I'm going to talk about the early claims, the probability, the marginal effects of early claiming of Social Security. So to obtain this results, I've merged the displaced worker survey with the annual social economic survey, because there are no direct questions about Social Security claiming in the displaced worker survey. And from that, I've obtained these results. So as we can see, for the variable on year is negative and significant. So the dependent variable is whether they claim Social Security earlier than full retirement age, so between 62 and 65. So over the time, full retirement age has gone up, so the probability of early claims has gone down. But the important thing to take away from this table is the coefficient for displaced workers. So it seems like people who, older workers between ages of 62 and 65 who experience job displacement are 10% more likely to claim Social Security earlier. So now to talk about the duration of unemployment, I'm gonna use 2 different hazard models, one single risk model with 3 specifications and a competing risk models with several exit destinations to compare how the disparities of time spent in unemployment by age. So this is just a basic Kaplan-Meier graph that just tells us that older workers are less likely to transition to a full-time job. So this is just comparing the transition times to a full-time job between young and old, and we can see that in every interval of time, they're less likely to find a full-time job. For the unemployment duration, I've used the 3 different specification of a survival hazard model, just to benchmark different the specifications together. So basically, I think I like the semi-parametric approach better, but as you can see, the exponential and Weibull the specifications also have similar coefficients, so we don't really need to worry much about how to define the baseline hazard function. So here, from these results, we can see that female workers spend much more time in unemployment compared to compared to male workers. So around 20% more time. Also, we can see a difference for Black workers. They also spend more time in unemployment before finding a full-time job. That's also around 20 to 28%. But the most pronounced effect that we can see is on older workers, and how it's going to take them more time to transition to a full-time job compared to their mid-career workers. And that's that coefficient ranges between 60% to 50%, depending on the kind of a specification for the survival model. And lastly, I want to talk about the cause-specific hazard ratios. So I'm not only considering when their workers are whether transitioning into a full-time job. I'm also considering the time that it takes them to transition to a part-time job, or stay unemployed, or just leave the labor force. So these are the 4 risks that I'm comparing together, and these are cause-specific hazard ratios. So for each column, we consider the outcome as being the censoring outcome, and then I've repeated that for full-time, part-time, unemployed, and not in the labor force. So here, the most prominent thing that we see is that older workers are basically the only options that they have is whether to stay unemployed or just to retire. And this is the not in labor force coefficient, also includes people who said that they're retired. So these 2 are less than 1, indicating that they're less likely to exit to these 2 destinations compared to unemployment and out of the labor force. And future steps, I want to make sure that I understand how labor market outcomes of older workers, how that's related to conditions of local labor market and the industry that they came from. I don't have any much control for the industry. Now I have public versus private, but I think a deeper dive on the industries that these older workers are displaced from are important. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Aida. I guess we knew that before, but now we know it more. Perry, Saygin, can you now help us out with a discussant? Beautiful picture.
Sorry, I'm just trying to get
Sure.
it.
And Perry, you need to unmute. Yeah,
yes, I will. Yep, I will do that. All right, let's go back to the beginning. All right, thank you so much for including me in this session. I learned a lot and I really enjoyed reading this paper. So let me give a very brief summary because Aida did a great job explaining everything very clearly. So I really think that this is a very important policy relevant research question, obviously. So she's looking at the job displacement and older workers in a comprehensive framework. So I think that the most important thing I really liked about this paper a lot of the papers in the literature, existing papers, are looking at the either, like how they recover from job displacement, or trying to find out the potential mechanisms and stuff like that. But she's also looking at the probability of job displacement together with the potential catch up or recovery from the job displacement altogether. Also looking at this like with a historical perspective, like whether over time there's a change. So in that sense, I think this is the highlight that I wanted to give. Really, really great to have this comprehensive analysis from all angles. And she finds that older workers are more likely to be displaced and less likely to recover. So they have larger loss in earnings and longer time until next job. And possibly they actually never recover, or they just stay unemployed, or they leave the labor force. So I think that the data analysis is very, very well executed. And she's using displaced worker survey, which is pretty good for this kind of research question, obviously. And she does a great job explaining the choice of method and its advantages compared to previous literature, previous papers tackling the same question. And also she provides a good discussion of results for the policy implications and further research on the topic. So my first question is about, so obviously, like, it's very clear to all of us that the job displacement is a tricky question to estimate due to the selection bias. And a lot of papers focuses on firm closures to get a kind of like an exogenous job displacement to see the effect of job displacement on potential recovery. So differently from them, like, you're looking at all involuntary job displacement, including possibly mass layoffs or any kind of layoffs. So do you observe, I'm not familiar with the survey, with this data set. Do you observe the type of displacement, like firm closure, mass layoff, and could you study them separately? Like, are older workers more likely to have any type of these displacements, and whether the recovery is looking any different based on the difference in the type of the displacement? And my next comment, there are like multiple comments on like kind of little things, but mostly related to methodology. So we are doing the probit models for reemployment and wage losses, where you define the wage loss, substantial wage loss, as 20% or more. And you report the probit models, but a potential referee might ask linear probability models just in case. And also to understand the wage loss a little bit better, I like the idea of, like, I think it's pretty standard to use like a certain percentage or wage loss as a percentage, and whether like look at that as a probability of like a substantial wage losses, it makes sense. But also, like, maybe like to understand the extent of the wage loss, you might want to look at the wage graph as a percentage instead of just looking at 0-1. Also, like, another potential referee might ask, like, why 20%? Like, you might want to talk about that a little. And maybe, like, even better, like, you could plot the wages and show how they evolve before and after the displacement, taking the displacement as 0 and how the wages recover after the displacement. And this would be actually, like a very simple one-shot graph, and this would give you a best picture to understand the wage graph, I guess. And then, and also another thing I thought about, like, I'm not sure when you look at the wage graph, like, you consider the next wage as a full-time wage or a part-time wage. So maybe you could also include part-time versus full-time and kind of like talk about earning loss instead of a wage loss, because it's very likely that probably they're more likely to be exiting to part-time jobs than full-time jobs. And if that's the case, I think you'll be kind of like disregarding that earning loss if you're just looking at the full-time next jobs that are full-time. And you could do that, obviously, like plotting the wages to part-time or full-time by age groups and gender and race, which I really like. So I think that would be really helpful. And for the hazard models, I wasn't sure if the unemployment duration is unemployment or non-employment, including the the just not being employed. And also, like, do you observe the period that they are on unemployment benefits? I think whether they have the claims, but I don't know how long they stay on the benefits. And I said that, but like you had the survival function graph on the presentation. I didn't see that on the paper, but you had it on the presentation. So I think it's very helpful to see that on a graph, because I think with the Cox model or any kind of survival analysis, numbers get like kind of ugly, but that's showing that on one graph. I think it's very helpful to see the exit rates to jobs against the time to next job by age, by gender, by race. And I think that would make it like super clear. And you can also do that like for the competing risk model to show the same survival functions. And this is kind of minor things, because I know that the draft you sent to me like as a very preliminary thing. So I'll just skip this one if you want. I mean, I'm gonna send you this. This is mostly talking about like how you could, improve the introduction for the paper. This is not really anything in terms of the results or the key message of the paper. So I think that's it. That's all I wanted to say. And thank you again for giving me the chance to read this paper, to give you comments. I hope that you find them helpful. I'll be happy to chat if you'd like to.
Okay, thank you so much. Just to, and that was very helpful, and I would really appreciate it if you could send me your feedback on email or something, so I can go through them carefully. But just to answer some of your questions. So yes, I can see that the reason why they got displaced to some degree. So it's either the place that they were working closed, or the shift was abolished, or there wasn't enough work for them. And that's something that I think I can also include in the probit models as different covariates to see if there's disparities between them. I'm a little bit reluctant to do that because the sample is not large as already is, especially when you focus on older ages, the sample size even shrinks more. So that's why I didn't include too much covariates in the probits. But thank you. Yeah, that's definitely important to look at. I also have results for the linear probability models. They're basically the same. They're very close. So I just, for the sake of interpretability, I chose the marginal effects of probit because it's just easier to give out percentages instead of trying to like compare the OLS coefficients over time. And for the so the earnings are restricted to people who moved from a full-time job to another full-time jobs, because I didn't want to basically convolute the results by the fact that some people might lose hours and move into a full part-time job after that. But I understand that that's important, and I need to include that. And yes, I can see if they receive UI. I don't really see the level of benefits, but I can see, I think in that data, it says that whether they are receiving UI or if they have exhausted the UI benefit recipiency. So, and also I've somehow worked on that before, and it's something that might be interesting to also look at for older workers, especially next year that the data comes out for the time of the pandemic. It's going to be interesting to see what I can gather from that information. So I think that data comes out in August of 2022. But thank you so much.
Thank you. Now we have time for discussion. We have actually we have a whole 15 minutes. It's amazing. Any crosstalk between the panelists? I always like that feature.
I wouldn't mind just jumping in for a minute. So I just want to say a couple things. It was a while ago, so neither Rich nor I or anyone else may remember what we were talking about, but maybe I do. So first, it was the issue of the sort of puzzle that I found kind of stronger evidence that stereotypes predict discrimination for middle-aged workers than for the older workers. One thing to remember is that, and this gets a little complicated. There's a model in the paper to sort of talk about this, but when the stereotype language is particularly effective at deterring applicants, you don't need to find as much discrimination in the correspondence study because those remember, these are real ads, right? The companies have posted it and they actually deter people, fewer people in the age group apply, and then you don't have to discriminate as much against them because you know, to hit your sort of target share old. So you can sort of get these inverse relationships between how much you see actual discrimination and how much you see stereotype language. We have a model in the paper that suggests that you're never gonna, you know, all you do is kind of weaken the evidence of finding the relationship we're looking for. So if we get it, it would even be stronger, but there is that kind of potential bias floating around there. I think Rich talked a lot, and then I guess the next paper in this talked about a little bit too is you know, the role of trying to encourage people to work longer and how can we. Rich talked about that, and the next discussion was more about should we. I think one of the important points I always try to make in this research is that, you know, we have a lot of supply side incentives to work longer. We pushed up the full retirement age. We've changed payroll taxes, and we could do more. We can have an EITC. We can eliminate payroll taxes. We can push the FRA out further, et cetera. And that's fine for people who can work. That, you know, we can argue about whether what you want to work is relevant, you know, but sort of whether you can or can't is something that's a little more exogenous. But the one thing I worry about is if we don't address the demand side barriers that age discrimination poses, you know, and we're still trying to sort of solve the fiscal problem of people not working longer when they're living longer, then we're going to keep making supply side incentives harsher and harsher and harsher. And already, even though the modest increase in the full retirement age from to 67 pushed down benefits at 62, I believe, by 20%, you know, like, you know, we're all academics, like we can work till, you know, whatever. I mean, it's not like our jobs are physically demanding. We may have a bit of a warped perspective, but as Gal's research showed, you know, some people, partly as a function of SES and health, and partly as a function of the jobs they're in and how those two things interact, it's real challenges for them to work longer. So I kind of think we need to focus on reducing demand side barriers, which is why I'm so interested in figuring out, like, if there's age discrimination and how to combat it. And then, like, we always have this problem, you know, if you can't work, you need support. And if you can work, we should encourage you to work and reduce the barriers to doing so. And that's kind of the challenge here. And I think when we just discuss, can they work, you know, these issues of can they work longer or can't they, we can't lose sight of the fact that it's not just the worker's decision, given sort of the repeated evidence, my work, Joanna's work, other people's work, which sort of uniformly finds age discrimination.
Okay. I totally agree. Anybody else? I think either speaking up or raising your hand would be good. I don't see anyone's hand raised. We could all see, are you about ready to say something? You are, I can tell.
I'm considering, I'm just giving
Okay.
everyone.
Go ahead, you have the floor.
So there was one point that I wanted to mention about Carl's presentation, which is, I think, relevant here. And it's how, like, we see how different people, and it's also the same about Aida's and Rich's presentation yesterday, that we see how people, for different reasons, cannot work longer and have to exit the labor force. But we don't really consider the differences between these things. And I was wondering if, like, people who have to exit because of work limiting disabilities financially have a better time because they can claim disability compared to those who are simply pushed out and discouraged and have to claim Social Security early. So we don't really differentiate these two. And it's very unfortunate because initially, like in early retirement plans, like retirement was part of disability insurance. Like at some point when firms weren't able to distinguish between disability and retirement, it's for NYPD, I think it was like that they first have the disability insurance and then they had to add retirement to that because they couldn't distinguish at some ages between disability and old ages. But now we are like kind of like separating these two systems completely from each other, and I think that's part of what causing this issue. But I'm interested to know like how different types of leaving the labor force have different implications, especially because these are different demographics who have to exit for different reasons.
You're asking Gal if people have to leave involuntarily, whether or not it affects. Okay.
Well, I think that's great. A great question. I guess I just say that when we talk about a work limiting disability in our paper, those are definitely not necessarily disabilities that would qualify you for a DI, a social security disability, because the criteria to qualify for SSDI are really stringent, actually. And you can have a lot of work limiting disabilities that don't rise to that level. I think especially for older workers, the SSDI criteria is that you can't find any job in the American economy that you're capable of doing. For someone in their early 60s, say, or in their late 50s, finding a job in the American economy that they've never done before and need retraining, and it's just not plausible for lots of those people if they have kind of lost the ability to do their career job, to find another job that would satisfy that. But they wouldn't qualify for SSDI. So I think that that's really a challenge actually for those people.
Yeah. Anyone else? I'm getting very smart chats from people, but they're not speaking up. just want to, you know who you are.
Just read their comments then.
I know. No, I better not. Anybody else? All right.
Go ahead. I think Teresa's talking about me, but I'm going to decline to read that comment because I'm not confident enough to do so. But actually, I had a question for Aida actually that was sparked by Gal's last point, which is on different industry trends. And either I missed it if you mentioned it, or whether that was anything that you've been able to examine about older worker displacement. And there, we can imagine that there could be trends within certain industries that lead to greater or lesser losses of firm-specific human capital or other types of expertise that affect the labor supply of these workers.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That's actually where I want to take the paper next. So now I'm not really considering from which industry they're being displaced. I'm just looking whether they were displaced or not. So I'm assuming that, for example, like the shift from the production industry to service industry, that could account for some of the increases in displacement that we're seeing among older workers. But I need to look at it more carefully to see, and also the racial composition of different industries. That's also something that might be interesting to look at and see like which racial group suffers more wage losses based on how they're represented in different occupations.
Is your sample big enough for this? It's not, all right.
So if I don't want to limit it to older workers, it might be, yeah.
Okay. My conscience just reminded me to thank Rich for taking over for me when I didn't show up on time. I apologize to everyone, but thank you, Rich. You're such a pro. I think our session is probably over, and I'll give a few more minutes for the last words, but otherwise we can say goodbye. Yeah, any last words? Okay, hope to see you all next year in person. Bye.
Organizing.
Thank you. Bye.